Okay, is there anything else? Are we good?
No, and if there's any time where you just need to pause or anything, let me know.
Yeah, especially like it's so long. So
Yep.
We could just sign like pause, please, and then we can get a drink or whatever.
Yeah.
Since it's an hour and 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'm flexible. But, all right, I'm gonna go. You ready?
Yep.
Okay.
Hi guys, how's it going? Welcome to the Frisco Historic Park and Museum. We have a beautiful day out here right now. We get to be in the gazebo. If you were here last week, it's probably a nice change of pace than being crowded into the log chapel. So today we have Nina from the Aspen Historical Society and Skylar, Northern Ute tribal member, and they're going to be presenting Stories of the Noosh, Tales from the Ute People. They'll present both the history of the native people of Colorado and the modern day Ute experience. It's a great one, so I'm really happy that you all are here today. Next week, our next lecture will be Lost Lodges of the Rocky Mountain National Park with Dave Lively, and that one will be back in the chapel again. But a couple other things going on through the historic park, just wanted to let you guys know about before we begin. On Friday, we have the free historic town tour. We will be meeting at the Schoolhouse Museum, just that building over there, at 10 a.m. It's free. You don't have to reserve a spot at all, so just show up at 10 a.m. with your beautiful, happy, shining faces, and we will take a walk back in time down Main Street all the way down to the marina. Saturday, we will be having the Masontown hiking tour, which goes about halfway up Mount Royal. It's a beautiful hike with a little bit of elevation gain, about 500 feet, so be prepared for that. If you guys are interested in that, feel free to sign up in the museum after the lecture, or you can call in and sign up for that. We still have some spaces left. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Skylar and Nina, and I really hope you guys enjoy today's lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. My name is Nina Gabbianelli. I'm actually the Vice President at the Aspen Historical Society. And along with Skylar Loma Heftiwa, we have been doing this presentation here. I think this is our 5th year. So I'm curious, has anyone been to one of our talks before? Okay, for those few that did raise your hands, thank you for coming again. No spoilers, okay, because I'm going to tell some of the same stories. Well, I am actually going to, I'm doing one new one, maybe. I can never remember what I tell you all, so. Thank you. So Skylar and I have the great opportunity of working within the school districts all throughout the Roaring Fork Valley, the Eagle River Valley, even on out to Parachute and Rifle and such, throughout the school year, sharing the story of the Native people. But unlike most presentations where your tribal member would show up in full regalia, we do a program where I'm going to talk to you. I'm non-native. I'm born in St. Louis, Missouri, all right? Gabbianelli, I'm Italian-American. So I'm going to share with you what it was like and what happened, but Skylar's going to share with you what it's like now, what it's like to grow up as a modern-day Ute. Because the Ute people are not dead. They are just not here in Colorado predominantly, as they were for hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands and thousands of years. We truly don't know, because the stories are all we have. And the stories were handed down generation to generation, grandparents to children, typically is how it would be done. And as the elders, the grandparents, they are the ones that know the most, right? They would share the history. But each family or clan within the tribes, and there were 7 tribes within the Ute Nation. And each of the stories were a little bit different, right? So the history is not necessarily agreed upon, even between the different tribes or the different families today. We do know in the Roaring Fork Valley in Glenwood Springs, there were bones found in a cave back in the 1990s. Those bones were removed with the sacred rites of a Ute tribal member and studied by the Smithsonian. They were dated over 8,000 years old. So we know there was human life in Glenwood Springs over 8,000 years ago, 6,000 BC, let's say. Some Ute elders say yes, that is a Ute person. Some say no, it was the people before the Ute people. However, for this presentation, we're going to go with the interpretation that they are the first people of Colorado. They were hunters, they were nomadic, so they were traveling through the mountains following herds of deer and elk. So they were here in the summertime when the water resource is abundant, right? When the plant life was excessive, when the animals were here. But as people and animals began to migrate and the snow began to fall, they moved further west, further south. And the Ute Nation encompassed most of what we call Colorado and Utah, a state named for the Utah people, parts of Wyoming, parts of New Mexico. The Uncompahgre Band claims ties to the kind of central mountains where we are. And the Uncompahgre Band is the band that Skylar's ancestors are from. Now, the first story that I want to share with you is the first story that would be shared with children, because without schools, they had to learn their lessons, right and wrong, how things came to be. Everything they learned from their elders, and most of it was shared through stories. So the art form of storytelling traces back to almost every native culture around our world and indigenous peoples. And one of the first stories is always the creation story. So I would like to share with you a version of the Ute creation story. Because even if you go to the Southern Ute Museum, the museum down in Ignacio, there's a beautiful Smithsonian and Ute created museum. The first exhibit is 5 different elders telling the Ute creation story 5 different ways. So there are many different versions to this story. This just happens to be my favorite. So, the Ute people believe in a creator named Sinawaf. Okay? They believe that Sinawaf created everything. The clouds, the snow, the flowers, the elk, the mountains, the rocks, the rivers, everything. Everything that we see, Sinawaf creates first, before people. He gets all the animals living peacefully amongst each other, and that took quite a long time. Then it's time to add the humans. But in order to add people, he had to make people. And in order to make people, he went out into the land and he began to gather sticks. Now he picked up long sticks and short sticks, tall sticks, small sticks, round sticks, flat sticks. They were all different colors, all different sizes. And he made a big pile next to him, and he sat down and he began to tie these sticks together, creating stick people. Now each time he finished a person, he put him into a big leather pouch or bag that he had next to him. So he spent days making the stick people, putting them in the bag, making the stick people, putting them in the bag, making the stick people, putting them in the bag. When he was finished, he tied that bag up real tight with a knot, because he had to go out into the land to see where the people should go. The hunter did need to be up here high in the mountains where the elk and the deer and the mountain bison were. And then the fisherman, though, needs to be where there's lots of water so he can fish. And the farmer, where the land is flat and the sun is in the sky all day long, not shaded by mountains. So while he's out in the land, he didn't want to have to carry that big, heavy bag with him. So he asks his friend the coyote to watch the bag for him. All right, so some of you know where I'm going. The coyote is often called the trickster, the prankster, the troublemaker, the mischief one, right? In most of the stories of this, region, the coyote represents, he's like that archetype of the trickster, okay? Now, I don't believe he's evil. I don't think he's the devil. I don't think he listens to directions. And because he doesn't listen to directions, he doesn't do what he's told. And because he doesn't do what he's told, he gets into trouble. In every story, the coyote gets into trouble, right? But Sinawaf created Coyote. He loves Coyote. He trusts Coyote. So he hands Coyote the big heavy bag and he says, watch my bag for me while I'm out in the land. But whatever you do, Coyote, do not open the bag. It was one instruction. Do not open the bag. Sinawaf goes away. What do you suppose Coyote did? He opens the bag. Now, I think he probably sat there with it for a while, but there was a smell. No, he had never smelled it before. And there's a sound, like voices, there's something inside the bag, and he needs to know what it is. He's so curious, he finally opens the bag. And when he does, out pops all the stick people, and they start walking around, and everybody families talking to each other. The only problem was they were speaking in different languages. And because they were speaking in different languages, they couldn't understand each other. So they talked a little bit louder. Well, that didn't do anything but make people angry. So now people are yelling at each other, screaming at each other, and soon fists are being thrown. And the coyote, he's getting very nervous. He needs everyone to get back into the bag. But no one can hear him because they're all running around. They're screaming, they're yelling, they're going off in different directions. And the next thing you know, everybody was gone. Out in the land. And the bag was open. Sanawaf was returning, and Coyote realized, uh-oh, he was in trouble again. And when Sanawaf came back and he saw that bag open, he was mad. He was really, really mad. He says to Coyote, I don't think you realize what you have done. Now the people are out in the land, they're in the wrong places. They are going to fight with each other because they can't communicate. They don't speak the same language. They're going to fight. And what they're going to fight about is the land, and there will be...
Hey, can you hear me, Erin? I think you froze. Yep. Hey, I think your screen froze. Did it freeze on your side?
Apparently I lost internet. I don't know. It's trying to connect again.
Okay, no worries. I just left the meeting, and then gonna join again. But it says please wait for the host, so no worries. Just let me know. Okay. No worries. That's just like technical issue that we have to work through. We can use for evidence.
Yeah, and my internet went out, so I had to like redo the router. And
Yeah.
I'm at my parents', so it's like I don't know really what there. Yeah.
No worries. So I think we're like at like.
And we're at like 10:50.
Oh, were we?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I was off. Okay.
Was that what you were gonna say?
I think I was reading the wrong part, so that sounds right.
Okay. Sorry.
You're good.
I just signed up for my mentoring thing because I forgot to email her till now.
No worries. I have Marty Taylor at 5. So, but I think some people interpreted the whole thing because because I was focusing on the first 5 minutes, and then I'm like, oh, okay, I better practice the whole thing.
I just did the first 5 minutes.
I know, that's what you told me. So, and that's pretty, the first 5 minutes is pretty, like, not as challenging, so that's good. But I'm really excited to meet with her.
It was really awesome.
I know, I'm really excited. Susan has all the hookups with people everywhere.
Did I tell you that she put me in contact with an interpreter in Minneapolis that she had just graduated from St. Cat's with her master's in interpreting. I don't know what she was studying, but I told her that we're heading that way, and she was like, "Oh, let me put you in contact with Jamie." And like, man, that was so nice. She's just a sweet lady, so you'll have a good time. But all right, sorry about that. I was just wanted to get that email out before I forgot, because it's Thursday and I just now remembered to even email to schedule next week. So and then, are you ready to go?
Yep.
Or do you want me to start it at like a little bit of hold on. Let me record. Did you want me to start it a few seconds early so you can like kind of gather your thoughts again and jump back in where you were?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
And then, will you record it? Oh, you are?
Yep, I am recording.
Cool. Sounds good.
Sinawov predicts wars over land in the Ute creation story. Right? Now he's so mad at Coyote, he banishes Coyote to the woods. He says, you have to go live alone off up in the hills by yourself forever. So the Ute people believe that when the coyote howls at night, he's crying because he's lonely. He wants to come home, but Sinawov will not let him. Now Sinawov goes over to that bag, and you know what? There were still people down in the bottom of the bag. So he puts his hand way down into the bottom of the bag, and he pulls out those remaining stick people. And he tells them they are his chosen people. They are the Ute people. And he places them here high in the mountains where they can be closer to him, their creator, and where they can watch over the land, take care of the land. The tree is your brother. It has a life and a soul the same as you. The elk, even though you take the life of an elk, you give thanks to that elk for its sacrifice. Thank you. So that your family and tribe can survive, right? They use everything about the animal, from the brains to the tail to the teeth to the meat to the skins to the bones to the intestines to the sinew, everything about that animal, right? Now, the Ute people did travel up into these high mountains, we know, for at least hundreds of years because of the evidence that is available. And the stories with Spanish explorers as they began to come up into this area and trade horses with the native people. So they were walking back and forth through these mountains for hundreds, maybe thousands of years every year. Say I use Grand Junction to Aspen as an example. Back and forth every year, okay? Horses introduced to them in the 1600s. Now they become great equestrians. They become one of the first tribes. They claim to be one of the first tribes to gain the horses from the Spanish and then introduce them to the Plains Indians. So that real iconic image of an Indian on a horse, that doesn't start till like 1700 in the U.S., right? So the native Ute people fight for their land. They protect their lands from other tribes, right? They are warriors. They're here in this area, but the trading with the Spanish explorers is rather peaceful. They're just coming through and exploring, and there isn't real conflict necessarily. until actually Mexico fights with Spain to acquire the land in western Colorado, what we call western Colorado. And then the U.S. fights with Mexico because they wanted the land, okay? So 1848 is the year that the United States acquires the land that is in western Colorado. But what white man could live up here, so they just left it to the native people for another decade, until 1858, when gold was discovered down in Cherry Creek. And people, non-native people, began to move west into the eastern slope, the flat Denver area, and mine up on kind of some of these eastern slopes. And in 1861, the territory of Colorado is established, a few years later. A couple of years after that, there's a treaty signed by Honest Abe Lincoln. Honest Abe signs a treaty with the Ute people, giving them everything west of the Continental Divide in perpetuity, which means forever. And yet that's where I live. So, what happened? Well, you see, over the course of the 1860s and the 1870s, there were many studies being done. Geological surveys, the Hayden survey is kind of the big one. But it was proven that there was a mineral belt that extended from Boulder down through the Rocky Mountains to Durango. And that mineral belt contained not only gold, but also silver, copper, lead, tin, coal, all of which we needed as a growing nation. So the treaties began to change a little bit. First, we take back the San Juan Mountains, the Telluride area. I'm just going to let it pass. Then they begin to change the treaties, promising the native people food, annuities in exchange for their lands. And there are agencies set up around the area. And in 1876, Colorado became a state. August 1876, we're the centennial state, 38th state in our union. And at that time, tens of thousands of non-natives live in the eastern Front Range, and the back 2/3 of our state was about 3,000 or 4,000 native people and a few mining camps, okay? So in 1879, a couple of different things happened. A, the U.S. government decides to inflate the price of silver and begin to buy silver and gold to back the dollar. In other words, go west, mine silver, we're going to buy it at an inflated price as much as you can provide, and the Rocky Mountains are full of them, full of it. So that provided a motivation for people to move into what was native land, right? So there were conflicts in that area. Then also, in the fall of 1879, there was a battle in northwestern Colorado in the Meeker area. Nathan Meeker, non-native Nathan Meeker, was the agent overseeing the Indian agency in that area. And he had some different ideas on how the native people should live. He didn't want them to be nomadic. He didn't want them to be hunters. He wanted them to be farmers. He didn't want them to acquire horses. He wanted them to kill off their horse population, stop racing, we'll dig up the land, we can farm that land. You need to be Christian. A lot of ideas that just didn't work with the way the native people believed they should be living, right? So there was a battle in the fall of 1879 in northwestern Colorado. It's often referred to as the Meeker Massacre, but I'm going to call it the Meeker Incident, because a massacre would imply that they didn't know they were going to be fired upon. But what really happened was the native people told the military, when called in to protect poor Nathan Meeker, and you can see my bias, the military agents, some of whom the native people have fought with in the Civil War. So native people fought for this land, not the government, the land, right? And they fought with Major Thornburg. They say, don't cross this line. If you cross this line, we're going to attack, okay? That is not a surprise, right? They crossed the line. The Ute people did attack. There were many lives lost. Both Nathan Meeker and Major Thornburg were killed. Many Ute lives were lost as well. And what happened was there were 2 women and 3 children taken hostage, white women and children, taken hostage by the Northern Ute tribe. And they were held in captivity for 23 days. Now, there are varying stories upon what happened. Josephine Meeker, Nathan's daughter, actually initially said when returned to her family in Denver after 23 days of captivity that she had been well cared for and there was no harm done to them. Within the native tribe, it was very common that if you kill the father in a battle, you're going to take the wife and child into your family and care for them. That was your duty, that was your obligation, right? So that's one side. The other side would be that as the media got involved and started to change the story, the natives had been savaged, they'd been ravaged. And what it did was it incited Governor Pitkin, who was the governor of a 3-year-old state at this point, representing tens of thousands of non-natives who lived here. He removed the native people. His campaign was, "The Utes must go." That was the headline of the Denver Post.
Sorry, I was just not as prepared for this as
No, you're fine.
super prepared. So I was just I kind of missed part of that.
No, you're fine. Just recollect.
Okay.
Are you good?
Yeah, so I think I'm just gonna kind of drop that.
Yeah,
We'll
start over. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, you got it.
With a really horrible photograph to go with it, or drawing. So the native people were removed by 1880 to reservations. There are 3 Ute reservations. Remember, there were 7 tribes within the Ute Nation, or perhaps even more. But 7 tribes were consolidated to 3 reservations. 2 in southern Colorado, one's around Ignacio, that's the southern Ute reservation. Then there's the Mountain Ute Reservation in the Four Corners area, and the Uncompahgre and the Uinta and the White River Utes were given land in northeastern Utah. Now, that area is flat and barren and not a lot of water. It's rock. It's nothing like the mountains that the Uncompahgre were familiar with, that's for sure. So they had to change how they lived. They had to change how they ate. Everything about their lifestyle had to change in order to survive. And they did. And they are, actually that land that was given to them that was considered useless in 1880 is now rich with oil and natural gas. So they're actually a rather wealthy tribe, yes, we would say? Yeah, Skylar's shaking his head. I just got to make sure I'm right. So the native people, over the course of 1880 to today, there have been some other changes. In 1924, they were considered citizens of the United States for the first time. 1924, less than 100 years ago, native people were considered citizens of the United States. And yet we're still arguing over citizenship. Isn't that interesting? So, we try to learn from history. When I share this with 8-year-olds, I say, we thought differently as a society 100 years ago. I couldn't vote 100 years ago because men thought women had smaller brains, right? So the same was thought of the native people, and hopefully over time, 100 years from now, we'll be a little bit further than we are today, right? Now, they still couldn't vote, though, even though they were citizens. In fact, there are some northern Ute tribes in northern Colorado that were not given the right to vote until the 1970s. Is that not extraordinary? So the native story has not been shared very often. And Skylar, gratefully, is of a generation that his parents had enough, tradition within their family to share with him. But there are some people who don't. Because the generations from 1880 to 1920s and 1930s and 40s were stripped of their culture. They were taken to boarding schools as children. They were beaten if they spoke their own languages. They did not learn the history, and they didn't want their children to suffer the same way they did, so they didn't teach them anything. So there's 2 generations that had a difficult time both learning and sharing this story, but now we have gratefully, we have a generation that's growing up on the reservation today that, despite the fact that they can travel anywhere and live anywhere, the majority of them.
So I think you're doing a really good job because you're remembering like 2 sentences behind. So maybe just skip like that sentence and just stay a little bit closer. Because you're adding all the information, you're just working, you're a little bit farther back, but you're like, I can't believe you can remember all that. Yeah. You're doing good.
We have one northern Ute tribal member that lives in the Roaring Fork Valley. From Aspen to Glenwood, 1. That's Skylar. Thank God. And but the majority of the Skylar's generation now wants to share the story. They're learning their language and they're sharing it. And by sharing it, we're hoping that we're able to bridge some of the misconceptions and the gaps. And that's also why, you know, Skylar brings his regalia, but he doesn't wear his regalia, right? It is not a costume, and I'll let him tell you more about that. But yet something like, you know, you have a tuxedo if you go to a wedding, right? You put on you know, it's not a costume, it's just your fanciest dress. I got dressed up for you all today, right? That is kind of what it was like, what happened. And I'm going to let Skylar tell you, I want to tell one more story. Can I tell one more story? Okay. I want to tell one more story. And this is another Ute story. When I first began working as a storyteller and beginning to tell Native stories, I wanted to tell all Ute stories, right? So I got this great book that was Ute Tales, and a lot of the stories in there, they were warriors, and it was a different culture, and most of the stories are inappropriate for 8-year-olds, unfortunately. So I did find one. It is called The Coyote Steals the Blanket. Okay, so we're going to tell another coyote story, and I'm not bashing on coyotes, I like coyotes, but somebody has to be the troublemaker, right? So the coyote, also a very proud animal, used to walk around in kind of the desert areas of Colorado and would exclaim quite often, boasting, "I am king of the desert, and I can go wherever I want and do whatever I want, and nobody can tell me what to do." Well, a lot of the animals were kind of sick of hearing that. But one day, he's walking around boasting, and here comes a hummingbird. She comes down to Coyote and says, "Coyote, I hope you enjoy your walk today, but whatever you do, do not go into the valley around the rock over that cliff, because it's very dangerous." Coyote looks at the little hummingbird and says, "I am king of the desert, and I can go wherever I want and do whatever I want, and no one can tell me what to do, especially not a teeny tiny little hummingbird." The hummingbird said, "All right, but if you do go into that valley, whatever you do, do not touch any of the beautiful blankets that are covering the rocks in the valley." She flies away. Well, Coyote, of course, went right around that cliff and into that valley, and when he got there, there were dozens and dozens of rocks covered with beautiful blankets. Oh, they were such gorgeous colors. There were green ones and red ones and yellow ones. And there was this one purple blanket. And the coyote went up to it and he tied it around his neck like a cape. And he said, "Why, this is royal. This is befitting king of the desert." And he began to run. And as he did, that blanket waved in the wind. And he thought, "This is the way I should travel." And as he's running along with that blanket flowing over his shoulders, he hears this ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum behind him. He looks over his shoulder. All he saw was a rock rolling on the ground. So he began to run a little bit faster, and wouldn't you know it, ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. He looks behind him. There still is that rock rolling along behind him on the ground. So he was becoming a bit puzzled. So he decided he was going to zig to the right, which he did, and the rock zigged to the right. And then he zagged to the left, and the rock zagged to the left. Now he was not only puzzled, he was becoming a little concerned, but he said, "I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to run up the hill, because we all know a rock cannot go up a hill." So he begins to run up the hill, and as he does, behind him he hears, ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. That rock is coming right up the hill behind him. So now there's something wrong here. This rock seems to be chasing him. And he has to keep running, because if he stops, the rock will roll right on top of him. So he continues to run and run and run and run and run and run. And now it's getting to be like close to lunchtime, and his pads on his feet are hurting, and he needs to stop for a little bit of water. He's thirsty, but he can't stop because that rock is chasing him. And he doesn't know what to do, and that's when he spots the bighorn sheep is up there on the left. Now the bighorn sheep has big, strong hind legs, and if that sheep stands in the path and just kicks at that rock, I'm sure he'll be able to stop the rock. So he runs up to the bighorn sheep and he says, "Please help me, stand in the path of the rock that is chasing me and kick at it." And bighorn sheep says, "Well, of course I'll help you." He steps on down into the path, and here comes the rock, blump, 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 splat, blump, blump, blump. it just flattened that bighorn sheep right there on the trail. Now the coyote had to keep running. The bighorn sheep kind of shakes it off and walks away. And the coyote is very concerned now because this seems that this could be very, very serious. He's going to have to keep running forever. And he doesn't know why the rock is chasing him. He's very confused, but he has to keep running. So he keeps running until, oh, thank goodness, there's the elk. The elk is the biggest animal he knows. The elk can stop this rock, no doubt. So he runs up to the elk and he says, "Elk, please help me. Stand in the path of this rock and stop it from chasing me." The elk says, "Of course, Coyote, I'll be happy to help." He walks down into the path. Here comes the rock, blump, 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 splat, blump, blump, blump. Knocks that elk right over onto the ground, flattens it, and continues on chasing the coyote. Now the coyote is getting very concerned. It's getting to be dark, and he has been running all day long. He doesn't have much energy left, but this rock is gaining on him. And that's when he hears... The little hummingbird comes back down and says, "Coyote, I can stop the rock from chasing you." Coyote says, "Oh, really? A hill couldn't stop the rock. The bighorn sheep couldn't stop the rock. The elk can't stop the rock. But you, teeny tiny little hummingbird, you're going to stop the rock?" And she says, "Yes, because see, I know why the rock is chasing you. I know why it's angry. The spirit of the rock is mad because you took a blanket that did not belong to you. And if you return the blanket, the rock will stop chasing you." And the coyote is running along saying, "Yep, the blanket was just sitting there. No one was around. It looks so good on me. I need to keep it. It's beautiful. It's mine. I want it." Then he thought, but if I keep it, I have to keep running forever. So begrudgingly, he unties the blanket, he throws it down on the ground, and that rock, blump, 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 comes to a stop, but right on the coyote's tail. So now, he's given back the blanket, but the rock won't set him free. And the hummingbird says, "You need to apologize to the rock, and he will set you free." So the coyote turns around to the rock and says, "I'm sorry." And the rock rolled off of Coyote's tail, and Coyote took off as fast as he could. And the hummingbird just shook her head and said, "You know what? I do not think that coyote will ever learn his lessons." And that is my story. So these stories were used to teach lessons about, don't steal. That's a good one, right? Not to brag, to listen to warnings, right? There's a lot of different lessons within the story that were used to teach. Skylar, however, did go to school and learned a lot. And I want to turn the floor over to him now to tell you what it's like to be a modern day Ute in our society, right? In his society. It's ours. It's yours. Skylar Loma Heftiwa.
Hello. Hello. Good afternoon. Mike. Mike. Nuga one. Taviwanuch Nunai Nia Skylar Loma Heftiwa. So my name is Skylar Loma Heftiwa. I am of the Northern Ute tribe, and I'm here to share with you a little bit of what it's like to be a Native American or an Indian from India. No. But Ute tribal member. I'm officially a Ute as it pertains to the United States government. I'm enrolled federally with the Ute tribe of Utah. And I'm also part Hopi and part Choctaw. So I have a few different native tribes within myself that I was raised with. But I identify mainly with Ute and Hopi because those are the two tribes that I was raised with culturally. So let's have another round of applause if we can for Ms. Nina Gabbianelli. She's a great storyteller. Sometimes I wonder if people question, because she's, like she states, she's a non-native telling these, native stories and everything, but she does a really, really good job. Better than I could do, actually. She's very animated, very descriptive. It's very, very awesome in my mind, in my perspective. Anyway, so I think she does a really, really good job telling these stories, and it hits upon a lot of mentalities that are really different, because this is the way that Native people teach in the older days as well as today still. When I was growing up in elementary school, we had an immersion program called Waikupa, which was teaching the Ute culture, Ute language to us as little kids, and part of it was the stories, like the one Nina stated, the creation story, and some of the other, children's stories. But these stories are kind of a teaching tool on how to be a good person, more or less, and lessons that you learn in life, and use the characters of nature, like the animals. And in some of these stories, they go way back thousands of years, where there was a time when the animals were like people too, because in a way we're all animals ourselves. We all have made up of the same matter organically, with we got a heart, we got eyes, we got hair, some of us more hairy than others. But this is kind of the old style of Native belief, a perspective and thought process that we had hundreds and hundreds of years ago, was that we're related to the animals and they're related to us. So like we use that in our prayers and some of our thinking in the old days of how we hunt, how we pray. The animal spirits are like our brothers, or they're a relative of ours. And some of this thinking is how I was raised, and also when I got introduced as a young boy into hunting, because hunting is a big part of the Ute culture for hundreds of thousands of years, and still is a part of what we do today. But that has changed just like everything else has. And I guess more or less I'm an example of...
Sorry.
No, it's okay. So 49, 41 is when you go back on. So
Okay.
yeah.
I saw you doing this and I was like, wait, I'm not switching. Oh.
I know. So
you want to switch?
Yeah, because I did 17 minutes and this is another 17 minutes that you did.
Oh.
So now I do 17 minutes, and then at 49, 41, like around there.
Okay.
You'll start again.
Okay. That just felt faster.
Yeah.
But maybe because all right, sorry. No, you ready?
Yeah.
Change in culture, and I guess some of you already know this very well, that change is a constant thing that happens. Change is always going to happen. 50 years from now, life and society is going to be way different than it was 50 years ago. I'm sure some of you can remember a time when, the mentality in America was different, right? Like everything's different nowadays with technology and social media, and just everything's different now. And as opposed to 100 years ago, everything was different, and a couple hundred years ago. And then 500 years ago, when America was wearing, you guys would have been wearing those little white wigs, and everything was different. Fashion changes. And so that's what I like to explain and compare with our Native people as well. Because people will look at me sometimes and think that, well, the culture's gone, you're not a real Native because I'm not dressed in a war bonnet or wearing a feather and wearing buckskin clothes. But that's fashion. That's just something that Native people did 150 years ago. Just like you would have been wearing pioneer clothes. You would have been wearing 5 layers of clothes to show off how rich you were. Just because times were different, the mentality was different 150 years ago. But it's not the same now. This guy's wearing shorts and a nice polo shirt, whereas 150 years ago, that would have been, outrageous. Look at this guy, they would have said. Just the same with myself. The Native people 150 years ago would have looked at me and said, what are you wearing? But maybe they might not have. Maybe another pioneer person might have thought, hey, that looks really comfortable. Same with me. A Native Ute person might have saw what I'm wearing and said, wow, That looks crazy, but that kind of looks comfortable. So this is what I like to talk about a little bit, is the constant of change and everything, the evolving of people and cultures. So what I like to present is a more down-to-earth, realistic view of Native people, like Nina stated. You know, some presentations, you know, it's more about the flash, pizzazz, feathers, you know, the same kind of stereotype a little bit. Whereas I like to approach it a little different, where it's just a more down-to-earth, realistic view. You know, there's good and bad in every culture, and the same with Native people. We're not all spiritual Native people praying in a sweat lodge. We're, you know, some people are, you know, doing whatever they're doing, just as it is in society with all people. Like, I'm sure there's you know, the priest down the road, and then there's the, you know, homeless person in the street just a few feet away. It's the same with Native people as well. So I like to just point that out and just point out the realistic, you know, side of Native people. But I also like to celebrate the positive things that are happening, the retaining of our culture. Like I stated just a few minutes ago, I introduced myself in the little bit of Ute that I know. My parents were not raised with the native language as fluently as my grandparents were. When I was a little kid, I used to hear my grandparents speaking Ute, and to me it was like a code talk. I'm like, what does that mean? And they wouldn't really tell me. And a part of that belief was they did not want me to have a hard time with my education. In their mind, education was the key to be successful in American society. And their time growing up when they were young it was not cool to be a native, a Ute person, an Indian. It was a really hard time for Native people in the 1940s and 50s, growing up as their younger years in the 30s, 20s, 30s, because there was a lot of animosity, a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination, prejudice, and so they had to endure that. And so growing up, they taught my parents, well, we don't want you to have the same problems, so we want you to just learn English. And so that is one of the breaks there with myself, with my native language. But like I said, in my growing up in school, it's a return back to our native culture and native ways. And it's a lot maybe was lost, but we're reintroducing or reintegrating a lot of our language and culture in our ways. Some things were not completely lost, like some of our prayers and spiritual beliefs and religious ceremonies. They had to go underground in a way, but they survived, just like our, in my tribe, in the Northern Ute tribe, our main ones religiously is the Sundance ceremony. There's 2 Sundances we have on our reservation, and another one is our Ute Bear Dance, which I'm really, really highly involved in. And these dances have been done for hundreds and hundreds of years. But for a time period, it was kind of almost illegal for these things to happen. So they had to incorporate ways to make it okay in the eyes of the non-Indian American society of the time, which was to introduce the Christian aspect of some things. Oh, look, we're praying to Jesus, or we're praying to, you know, the Christian side, see? So it's okay. And so that made it okay for, you know, the non-native people. Oh, okay, there's a Christian aspect to it, so it's okay. Same with the Pueblo people, I noticed. I went to school for 1 year at the boarding school in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a school that was made up for the Pueblo people, the 19 Pueblo tribes of the Rio Grande down in New Mexico. And their culture, I noticed, is really integrated with the Christian aspect, because they wanted to retain their culture and their language, and this was their only way they could keep it strong in their mind at the time. So they incorporated a lot of Christianity in it. Whereas my father's side, my father's tribe, the Hopi side, they didn't use the Christian side. There's no Christian in it. So in my mind, I think that's kind of very lucky to not have the Christian side. And I don't know if this is, in my perspective, in my perception, I think I'm lucky to be a heathen. I'm a bona fide heathen. I'm not baptized in any Christian way or anything, but I appreciate, you know, what it is, you know, Christianity, the people that believe in it, and follow, the 12 commandments, all the ways to be a good person. I don't mind that. That's cool. But I'm sure it's changed over thousands of years with the interpretations and meanings behind Christianity and politicized. And I mean, you could just watch the news and see how it's used that way. But that's another example of the change of time, I guess. But back to my Indian stuff, my native stuff. I also like to joke about that all the time with the word Indian, and I don't mind it myself because I've grown up with that myself. But like I joke with some of these presentations, I've really met people from India, and they correct me. They've corrected me about that. So, and it makes me think, and it's a real thing. We aren't Indians. We're native people, and then the question comes up, well, what are you, or what do we like to be called? And it boils down to just learning about our people and our history and our language and culture, and what we identify with is our whatever tribe we are, whatever tribal nation we are. So I'm Ute, so you're a Ute American, just like Nina's a Italian American descent. I'm a Ute American descent, and Hopi and Choctaw. And learning about these, different tribes, just like some of you, we're all Americans, but some of you are coming back from a different background of European background, of German American descent, Italian American, Polish American, Russian American, Arabic maybe, or whatever it is, Spanish sides, the Hispanic people. And then I also like to point out, some of the mainstream American society culture, everything is rooted from Europe. Like our language we speak, English, even though it's American English, is born from England, right? Just like Spanish. Spanish comes from Spain. These are all rooted in Europe. So that's what makes the difference, I guess, from an indigenous culture of the Americas and the American culture. I think what I find out in my lifetime here is that this is a very sensitive subject. When I talk about my native heritage to where I live now, it's a very sensitive subject that creates a lot of instinctive reaction of negativity, because people don't like to feel bad about something they feel they had no part of. Because I know none of us were alive 150 years ago when things happened. None of us had a part of it. But we're living with the effects of it now, still. And when I have this conversation, I've been living in the Roaring Fork Valley for 12 years now, which is Glenwood Springs to Aspen. And there's not a big native community there of Ute people of any tribes, really. There's a few tribes, a few Navajos I've ran into, a few other native people. But for the most part, it's a big non-native population of just regular Americans and maybe some immigrants that are there now as well. But when the subject of Native people and heritage comes up, I always notice that when I start to speak on things just to regular Joe, worker bee people, they get a negative reaction. And I still am trying to figure out how to have this conversation and discussion to make it a proactive healing process so that we can better understand each other's cultures and learn to move forward in a positive direction without hanging on and clinging on to a negative aspect of it. And I've noticed some of the discussion when you talk about the atrocities and the negative and really emphasize the negative all the time, it turns people off and people don't want to hear it anymore, and they just like, oh, whatever, I'm out, I don't want to hear that, I wasn't a part of it. So people walk away from it and then nothing happens, it just stays the same. And then you move to 5 years later and it's still the same discussion and the same feeling. So what I am trying to figure out is to find a way where we can have this discussion and move forward in a positive direction. So, but one thing I'd like to point out all the time that creates this negativity is when I point out the disconnection of American people from their roots. And once people embrace their roots, I notice with some people that it works. When people embrace the European roots of their history and culture, then it's more of a positive forward direction. There's an acceptance and an acknowledgement of where we're all coming from. And then that's a move forward in my mind, or what I've seen with some people. But if you choose always to disconnect from your culture, your heritage and roots, then there's always going to be some sort of a negative, lost. You're kind of lost. You don't know where you're coming from. And I notice with American society, there's a big disconnection, because there's a disconnection. We're not European anymore. We're Americans. We're not from Europe. We're Americans, even though we're using English forms of measurement, which is weird, because the rest of the world is using metric, but we're hanging on to an old world style of English measurement. Why? If we're so separated from Europe and England, why are we using English forms of measurement? That's the funny thing to me. But anyways, some of the things I point out like that, I think it just, the first reaction is always negative. But when we talk about it in a positive way and figure out a way how we can, just acknowledge it and say, hey, that's cool. That's really cool. Your culture is a little different than my culture, but I'm okay with that. We don't need to hate on it as much. That's something I think that helps the discussion, is learning to just not be prejudiced about things, prejudging a culture because it's so different than another culture. Perspective, learning how to put yourself in the other culture's shoes and try as hard as you can to understand why it's that way, or even if you don't understand why, just acknowledging that you don't know and that it's going to be different, but you're okay with that. That's something I think that we can work on as well with the native cultures, is seeing how the native people perceive things. Like, even though what happened a long time ago is in the past, we don't want, people tell me all the time that I need to get over it. Get over it, get over it. I'm like, get over what? Like, this is my family and relatives you're talking about. Get over my relations, because that's part of the connection with Native people. I think that's a little different than the non-Native American people. Is like, even though these people are gone 100 years ago, that's my family. Even though they're gone 1 year ago, that's still my family. We are still connected to them. That's my ancestors. That's whose blood and genetics are flowing through me. It's what makes my skin dark, makes my eyes and my facial bone structure the way it is. They're living on through myself. So that's my family. And you're telling me to get over my family and my language and my culture and everything that identifies me as a different, culture, as one of the First Nations and the first peoples of the land here. And I think people don't want to feel bad about that, because they see it in me, and it's I guess a hurtful reminder of history that's happened that they feel they don't have a part of, which they don't, but being dismissive of the whole thing is actually indirectly supporting it in a way, in my mind, in my opinion anyway. So at least acknowledging it is a move forward as well, I think, instead of just being dismissive and saying, well, that's whatever. And that's indirectly supporting it in a way. And saying to get over it all the time is also indirectly supporting it. It's more or less telling me I need to not be Indian or not be Native anymore, like what happened to my grandparents, when they were told not to speak the language, not to practice our religion, practice our spiritual ways. When you're telling me to get over it, you're also telling me to do the same thing. It's pretty much the same thing in my mind. Telling me I can't do bear dance, sun dance, any of those things anymore, when you're telling me to get over it. So that's a discussion I think that we can work on as well. But anyways, that's a little bit I'm sharing of what I think, and I am only one person, and these are only my opinions, and I'm pulling from my own experience growing up as a Native on the reservation. I grew up in the Northern Ute Reservation, which is based in northeastern Utah, and I also visited my Hopi side, my father's side, in northeastern Arizona as well. So those two cultures that I grew up with really shaped how I view the world and what I think of things. I also, base a lot of my opinions on books I've read on Native subjects. A big author that I was really into really brought some fire into me when I was a youthful person, really made me mad, was Vine Deloria Jr. I don't know if you've heard of this author. He's passed away now, but he was a Native American or a Native author, and he did a lot of social commentary books on Native issues of his time, and it still relates to today's day and age. So that is a little bit of my background, what I base what I talk about in these presentations about. A lot of my education background. I've had some college. I'm a bona fide college dropout. I plan to finish someday, but just life in general, I've had my ups and downs. I'm not the perfect, example of a good person, but I think that's all of us as well. We've all got our faults as well. But I plan on going back to school and finishing that, working on something to help me do these presentations as well. But anyways, that's a little bit of my background, where I'm coming from and what I do. Like Nina said, a lot of our presentations are with the schools, and what I like to do is show a visual aspect of my Native culture, and I bring up here some of my what I wear at the powwows. I've grown up involved in powwows. Have you guys heard of powwows? Definitely. So I kind of show my beadwork. This is what I've worn, and I'm what they call a grass dancer. I participate at the powwows as a grass dancer. So I grew up as a little boy involved with powwow. My parents were involved with powwow, and I think that's how they met. So that's how I became a Ute Hopi Choctaw guy. So because they were involved in powwow, I was involved in powwow, and I was a little kid, 2 years old, already in a powwow outfit, dancing at powwows. And I just grew up with it, and it's just a part of me that's so much a part of me, I can't think of really it being not a part of me. So when I talk to the little kids, I kind of more or less just put on my powwow outfit in front of them. And in a way, it's like I transform in front of them. So this is only the beadwork part of my outfit that I put on. And then I just describe, now I look like a real Native, and they say, yeah. So this is just a part of my culture that's a little different, I guess, but it's also an American culture, indigenous Native American culture, getting into all these politically correct words and descriptive words, but, or you can just say there's an Indian, but that's not really accurate either. So this is my beadwork that I show the kids, and actually all of you, everybody, the non-Native people. And this is just something that I wear at the powwows when I'm participating in the grass dance. And then I notice with a lot of the schools, there's a lot of Latino kids, Latino Hispanic kids. And their culture is a little different. It's another part of American culture, but it's a little different. And I asked them, is there a part of your culture that you wear like this, maybe at something you do? And at first they struggle, and then I just kind of, push it forward and say, I've heard of a quinceañera, and then they'll talk about oh yeah, the quinceañera, and they say, is there something you wear there? And they say, yeah, we wear this, we wear that. Okay, and then see, I'm very ignorant when it comes to Hispanic culture, so I don't know if there really is a Mexican hat dance or not. So I say, is there a Mexican hat dance? they kind of look at me funny. So. But there are, Hispanic cultural dances that they do, which is integrated with the Christian and some of the native Mexico people. They're evolving of culture, just like the native people of North America and the United States, how the Native American church, that incorporates a lot of the Christian ways in their prayers, I notice nowadays. And that's just what I guess you would call the evolution of culture, just like American society and American pop culture has evolved over the last 100 years. Change is constant. Native people change as well. So even though, this outfit, this beadwork might be a little more than what they wore 100 years ago, the meaning and the dancing behind it is very similar and very much close to the same. It's rooted in older dances of the grass dance from a Plains tribe, and today it's danced and it's shared with a lot of different native tribes. So if there was ever anything that you could call pan-native, where all the tribes participate in something, it's the Native American powwow culture and dance. You'll go to a powwow, you'll see a lot of these dances that are rooted in the Plains cultural tribes, but you'll see Navajos dancing these dances. You'll see Seminoles possibly. You'll see Chippewas, Lakotas, different tribes from everywhere. California now, some of the tribes from California I notice have, they're picked up the powwow cultural ways, and they have a big circuit of powwows in California with big prize money. So over the last 50, 60 years, powwow culture has evolved to incorporate a lot of contest dancing. So there's a grass dance contest, there's a fancy shawl dance, there's a women's traditional dance contest, and some of the prize money is up into the thousands of dollars. So you can make a pretty good living if you're a very good dancer going to this circuit of all these powwows. I used to do that in my teen years and early 20s, and I was okay. I was able to get around placing in these contests as well. I'm sure some of you have heard of the Denver March powwow in Denver, Colorado, every March. I actually placed in the contest in my teen years at that powwow. So that is my history of powwow culture, so that's something I can explain a little bit about. But there's also the traditional tribal aspect. When I talk about the tribal traditional aspect, nations I like to talk about and make a comparison to Europe, because when I've been to Europe quite a bit. When I've been to Europe, to me, I see it the same side as you would see the Indians at a powwow. You go to a powwow, you see all these Indians, and you're not too sure, they're all just a bunch of Indians, right? Dancing around, doing their thing. So when I go to Europe, that was me too. There's all a bunch of white people, but they're all German, French, Polish, the Deutschlanders. I learned a lot of, what makes them identify with their traditional tribal nation of Europe. And their history goes back thousands of years. And I thought, hey, well, that's like us over on this land in North America. Our traditional ways go back thousands of years too. And we're Ute, we're Lakota, we're Cheyenne, or Arapaho, different nations of people. And we might be a little bit different, but there's a similarity in our tribalistic ways, just like they are in Europe still to this day. When I was speaking to them, this was back in the 90s, and this is when they were starting the European Union. A lot of the people, they were against it. They were like, we don't want to be like the United States. We don't want to just be a bunch of European white people. We want to identify with who we are. We're Italian. We're not, German or, whatever they are, with the European Union. That was just the normal, everyday people in Europe, the Europeans, not the politicians. The politicians have their own whole different thing. Just like here, the politicians who we choose to speak for us and, guide us in our society, that's something we all have to live with. But, and we have to deal with the consequences of what they do as well, just like what we're going with today with immigration and everything, that's an issue, but, it's the politicians. But anyways, it's been the same constant thing, I think, for hundreds of years. But anyways, back to the differences of cultural beliefs and everything. Like Nina said, you know, we're coming from a whole different lifestyle. Native people, our culture and lifestyle was tied with nature. Moving with nature, the elements, migrations of deer and elk, that's embedded in us in our genes, I think, because we still hunt. We're pretty good hunters, I would say, still on the reservation. Although not everybody, you know, goes out with a bow and arrow and a spear. People use, you know, I use a 300 Weatherby mag, which is really nice. Can reach a long ways. I don't have to sneak as close as you would with a bow. But it fills my freezer, and when we we try to eat, you know, natural game meat. You know, we have buffalo, we have elk, we have deer, and we still dry a lot of meat, you know, in the older traditional way. There's people on the reservation who dry meat the same way, but instead of using deer or wood, making the wood, what is that called, little triangle grit thing, where you dry meat from, they use a wire or a chicken wire or something, you know, to dry the meat over the smoke. You know, that's just an adaptation. Another example of adaptation, but, you know, it's still the same stuff, is my drum here. This drum was made by a person up in Canada of the Cree Nation, but the person that made this drum, it's still deer hide, but the rim is, you know, commercially bought, and instead of using rawhide string or buckskin, it's, you know, baling wire or twine from, you know, baling hay. So that's adaptation, that's just evolution, evolving, cultural evolving, but it's still used for the same things. So, anyways, moving forward, what I also like to show is, share with people is, like I said, I grew up with powwow and everything. I share a little bit of singing because I grew up singing at the drums, and the kids really get a kick out of it. At first, Nina can attest to this. At first, because they've never heard it, you know, they'll laugh a little bit at first because they're nervous because it's so different. But once they, you know, get used to me singing in front of them, some of them will actually come up to me afterwards and say, "Hey, I learned that song. I know that song now. I can sing it." And they really like it, and they get a big kick out of it. So I'll share with you a little bit of powwow singing, if you don't mind. There's a song that they sing at the powwows called the flag song, and it was composed and made in the past for the American flag. And they usually have this at the what they call the grand entry of a powwow. So powwow also evolved a little bit from these old native dances, but there was a guy called Buffalo Bill, I think it was Buffalo Bill or Wild Bill Cody, who had a Wild West show, and he incorporated a lot of Indian dances in his Wild West shows. And to me, I believe this is where a lot of the modern powwow influence comes from as well, with the grand entry and bringing
Aaron, can you hear me? Did your internet freeze again? Hey, did your internet crash again? I think you were like 30 seconds before he was starting to play the instrument. So we can hop back on if you want. So just let me know.